16 minutes past midnight, June 6, 1944, a wooden glider carrying 30 British soldiers slams into a French field at nearly 100 miles an hour. The pilot is thrown through the shattered windshield. His co-pilot is pinned beneath the wreckage with a broken leg, 6 hours before the first American boot touches Omaha Beach. Before the first landing craft lowers its ramp at Utah, before John Wayne, before Saving Private Ryan, before any of the images you grew up with. The war in Western Europe has already been decided, not on the beaches, not by the Rangers, not by the men in the newsreels your father may have watched. By 181 Englishmen you have almost certainly never heard of, running in the dark toward a bridge that Adolf Hitler did not yet know he was about to lose. This is the story of the 10 minutes that broke the Third Reich. There is a bridge in Normandy that most people have never heard of. It carries no famous name in the popular retellings of the war. No Hollywood epic was built around it. No monument rises visible from the passing highway. It spans a modest stretch of the Caen Canal, just outside a quiet French market town called Bénouville. A steel girder span painted grey, with a small water tower rising beside it. If you drove past it today without knowing the story, you would forget it before you reached the next village. And yet, on the morning of June 6, 1944, this bridge was arguably the single most important piece of real estate in all of Western Europe. Not because of what it connected, but because of what its capture would prevent. To understand why, you have to understand something the German High Command genuinely believed to be true in the spring of 1944. Berlin had spent months arguing about how the Allied invasion would come, not whether, when and where. German intelligence had real assets working the problem. German planners had the geography of the French coastline in their favor. They knew with confidence that an invasion was coming. They simply did not know the day, and they did not know the beach. One man carried the weight of that uncertainty more directly than anyone else in the Wehrmacht. His name was Erwin Rommel, Field Marshal, 52 years old, commander of Army Group B, the man Adolf Hitler had personally chosen to defend the entire coastal shield of occupied France. He had earned his fame in the deserts of North Africa, where British soldiers had nicknamed him the Desert Fox. He had lost that campaign in the end. He did not intend to lose this one. Rommel had written to his wife that spring, in a letter that would later be quoted in every serious study of the invasion, that the first 24 hours would decide the outcome. Not the campaign, the entire war. He called it, in his own phrase, the longest day. He was completely correct about that specific point. He was simply wrong about which side the longest day would ultimately belong to. Rommel's defensive doctrine rested on one foundational belief. The Allies would come from the sea. They would need hours to organize themselves on the open beaches before they could push meaningfully inland. And in those specific hours, German armor would arrive from its staging areas and crush the beachhead before it could form. For that plan to actually work, Rommel needed his panzer divisions close to the coast, close enough to reach the water before nightfall of the first day. He argued for this position for months. He argued for it in memos. He argued for it in person. He argued for it in a meeting with Hitler himself at the Berghof. He lost that argument. Other German generals, trained in the older doctrine of a concentrated armoured reserve held well inland, insisted that panzers positioned too close to the beaches would be pinned down and destroyed by naval gunfire before they could ever mass for a decisive strike. Hitler, in his own way, sided with both camps at once. Some armour was moved forward, some was held back. And the release of any panzer division into combat still required the Führer's personal authorization. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody. And it was a command structure almost perfectly engineered to produce hesitation at the worst possible moment. Even inside that flawed framework, a genuinely workable German response still existed. The panzer divisions positioned nearest Caen, above all the 21st Panzer Division, could still reach the beaches within hours of receiving orders. But to do so, they had only one truly viable route toward the eastern flank of the landing zone. That route ran through a single unavoidable bottleneck. A pair of small bridges at Bénouville, set side by side barely 470 meters apart, one over the Caen Canal. One over the River Orne, Any German armour moving toward the eastern beaches had to cross both in sequence. No alternative existed that would not cost hours of extra movement time. German engineers had prepared for this. Both bridges were wired for demolition, explosive charges already in place beneath the roadway. If the Allies ever seriously threatened the crossings, the order would go out, the bridges would fall into the water below, and the armoured route toward the coast would remain firmly under German control by whatever slower approach remained. It was, by every standard of conventional military logic, a sound contingency. It simply assumed the threat would arrive from the direction of the sea. Across the channel, in the flat green fields of southern England, another man had been preparing for this exact bridge for 18 months. His name was John Howard, Major, 31 years old. Before the war, he had worked as a police officer in the city of Oxford. He was not a career soldier by original instinct. He was methodical, precise, fiercely competitive by temperament. He carried a policeman's mind into a soldier's body. And he understood, in a way many senior British officers of his generation did not, that a mission with no historical precedent could only be accomplished by men who had rehearsed every second of it until their bodies could execute it without conscious thought. Howard commanded D Company of the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. In the plain shorthand of the British Army, they were called the Ox and Bucks. 181 men, hand-selected, drilled to a standard the rest of the British Army had rarely seen. He had built them a mock-up of the Bénouville bridges on English soil, constructed to exact dimensions from aerial reconnaissance photographs. 2 full-scale replicas of steel and timber and canal water, standing quietly in a training area in the English countryside where no German aircraft would ever see them. He ran his men against that mock-up in daylight. He ran them against it at night. He ran them against it in the rain. He ran them against it in fog. He ran them against it exhausted, kept deliberately awake for days beforehand, because he knew the real mission would be flown by men who had not slept properly in a week. He ran them against it hungry. He ran them against it wearing full combat load, then again wearing half of it, then again with equipment deliberately broken to simulate battle damage. By the time the real operation finally arrived, several of his soldiers could reportedly move through the practice course blindfolded, purely from muscle memory. They knew the number of steps from the glider landing zone to the near end of the bridge. They knew which platoon would peel left, which would peel right. They knew where the pillbox stood, where the sentry boxes stood, where the anti-tank gun had been photographed from the air 1,000 feet up. They rehearsed the assault so many times that when the officers were interviewed afterward, several of them said they had genuinely stopped counting after 500 repetitions. Among those men was a 28-year-old lieutenant named Herbert Denham Brotheridge. Everyone called him Den. He came from Smethwick in the industrial Midlands. He had played football for the Aston Villa Colts before the war. He had risen through the ranks from private to officer, an unusual path in the class-bound British Army of the period, and he had done it because John Howard had personally seen something in him worth backing. Den Brotheridge commanded the platoon that would lead the assault across the canal bridge. The first man across, he had a wife named Margaret. She was heavily pregnant. He had never seen his child. Now here is the detail that mainstream retellings almost always leave out. The intelligence that made Howard's obsessive training possible did not come from British reconnaissance alone. It came from a small cafe that still stands today on the western bank of the Caen Canal, roughly 40 meters from the bridge itself. The cafe was called the Café Gondré. It was owned by a French couple. Georges Gondré had once worked as a bank clerk in Paris. He had a quiet, careful demeanor. He was not the sort of man who looked at first glance like a resistance operative. That was, in a very real sense, the point. His wife, Thérèse Gondré, was originally from Alsace and spoke fluent German. The Germans garrisoning the bridge did not know this. They drank in her café. They talked in front of her. They assumed the woman polishing glasses behind the counter could not understand a word they said. She understood every word. She listened while they complained about the food. She listened while they gossiped about the sergeant on the far bank. She listened while they discussed, in unguarded moments over cheap wine, which of their positions had been reinforced that week, and which sentries were sleeping on duty, and where the demolition wiring had been buried under the roadway. Thérèse Gondré passed what she heard to her husband. Georges passed it to a member of the French resistance in the nearby town of Caen. From there, it moved through a chain of couriers across the Channel and into the hands of British planners in England. The specific location of the demolition wiring under the bridge, the exact placement of the sentry boxes, the rotation of the guard, the strength of the garrison, every detail Howard's men would need delivered by a French housewife who had no guarantee of surviving the war herself, and whose name almost never appears in the popular telling at all. Her daughter, Arlette, was 4 years old that spring. She would grow up in that same cafe. She would eventually run it herself. And she would still be running it into the 21st century, serving coffee to the descendants of the men her mother had helped save. But that is a story for the ending. For now, in the first days of June 1944, everything is still in motion. And on the German side, at exactly the moment the Allies are finalizing their invasion date, a series of very human decisions is quietly closing every door the Wehrmacht will need open in 72 hours. The Allied planners chose June 5th and 6th for one specific reason. The tides and the moonlight aligned, low water at dawn to expose the beach obstacles. A full moon the night before to guide the paratroopers. That specific window would not open again for weeks. It also happened to fall directly on the 50th birthday of a woman named Lucy Rommel. The field marshal had not been home to his wife in months. She lived in a modest villa in the town of Herrlingen, near Ulm in southern Germany. Rommel had been reading the weather reports for days. Every meteorologist he trusted was telling him the same thing. Conditions in the Channel were deteriorating. Wind, cloud, rough seas. No serious invasion could be attempted in weather this bad. He was not wrong about the weather. He was simply working from a German meteorological picture that ended somewhere over the Bay of Biscay. The Allies, thanks to weather stations across the North Atlantic and Greenland that Germany had lost the ability to reach, could see 48 hours further ahead than he could. They saw a narrow window of moderating conditions. He saw only the storm. On June 4th, Rommel made a decision that would shadow him for the rest of his life. He would drive home. He would spend his wife's birthday with her. He would give her the pair of shoes he had bought her in Paris. He would return to his headquarters in France within a few days, refreshed, and continue preparing for the invasion he was now certain would not come until later in the month. He said goodbye to his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, at the Château La Roche-Guyon on the River Seine. He climbed into his Horch staff car. He drove east, toward Germany, toward his wife, toward a small town he would reach the following evening. He would not see the French coastline again for 2 full days, and he was not the only senior German commander who chose that specific week to be somewhere else. General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, the only significant armoured formation immediately available near Cannes, was in Paris that same night. He had a reputation among his fellow officers for owing his command more to political connections than to battlefield competence. He preferred the restaurants of Paris to the mud of divisional maneuvers. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army responsible for the entire Normandy sector, was inland at Rennes, attending a command exercise. The exercise's stated premise, in one of the more genuinely bitter ironies of the entire war, was a war game rehearsing the German response to a hypothetical Allied invasion of Normandy. The men who would need to make decisions in the first hours of the real invasion were, almost without exception, somewhere they should not have been. And Adolf Hitler, at his mountain retreat in Bavaria, had left standing orders that he was not to be woken. At the Château La Roche-Guyon, Hans Speidel watched Rommel's staff car disappear down the drive. He had no way of knowing that his commander would not return in time. He had no way of knowing that the weather report the Kriegsmarine had provided that morning was already wrong. He had no way of knowing that at that exact hour, on airfields across southern England, a young British major named John Howard was checking a wristwatch he would not take off for the next 36 hours. 6 wooden gliders sat in the fading light of a Dorset evening at an airfield called Tarrant Rushton. Halifax bombers were being fueled and rolled into position beside them. 181 men were finishing what they suspected might be their last hot meal. Some of them had written letters home the night before. Some had not. Howard walked the length of the line, checking each glider one final time. He knew every face inside those wooden fuselages. He had trained them, he had eaten with them, he had drunk with them at pubs across Devon and Dorset for the better part of 2 years. At 22:56, the tow cables would tighten. The bombers would begin their run down the grass strip. The gliders, laden with silent men, would rise into the darkening sky behind them. And by 16 minutes past midnight, on a moonlit field beside a canal in France, the entire war in Western Europe would begin to turn on the hesitation of an 18-year-old German sentry named Helmut Römer. He did not know yet that his name would matter, neither did anyone else. At 22:56 on the evening of June 5, 1944, the first Halifax bomber released its brakes and began rolling down the grass runway at Tarrant Rushton Airfield in Dorset. Behind it, connected by a single tow cable 100 meters long, sat a Horsa glider, 28 infantrymen strapped inside a wooden fuselage, plus 2 glider pilots up front, 30 men in total, in an aircraft made mostly of plywood, with no engine, no armor, and no chance of turning back once the tow cable was released. The lead glider was piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, a Manchester-born veteran of the glider assault on Sicily. Beside him, in the co-pilot's seat, sat Staff Sergeant John Ainsworth. Walwork and Ainsworth had spent weeks studying aerial photographs of the landing zone. They had memorized the exact angle of the canal, the height of the trees along the approach path, the position of a telegraph line that would kill them if they misjudged it by a few feet. Walwork would later say he could have drawn the landing zone accurately from memory in his sleep. He had studied it so many times, in so many lights, that the image of it had burned itself into the back of his eyelids. Behind him, in the belly of the glider, sat Major John Howard. Beside him, Lieutenant Den Brotheridge. Behind them, the men of D Company, arms linked, boots braced, waiting. None of them spoke. The Halifax lifted into the darkening sky. The glider rose behind it. In the fuselage, the temperature dropped. There was no pressurization. Several men held their noses and blew hard to equalize the pressure in their ears. Others simply stared at the wooden floor between their boots and thought about what came next. Some of them thought about home. Some of them thought about the drills. Some of them thought about nothing at all, in the way soldiers learn to think about nothing when there is nothing left to prepare and nothing left to say. Behind the first glider, 5 more rose into the same darkening sky, 6 wooden aircraft in total, 3 assigned to the canal bridge, 3 assigned to the Orne River Bridge, 470 meters to the east. The tow cables released at 7 minutes past midnight. From that moment the gliders were silent. There was no engine noise, no propeller wash, nothing to warn anyone below that they were coming. Just the soft rush of air across a wooden fuselage descending through the darkness at nearly 100 miles an hour. Down below, in the fields of Normandy, the German garrison at Bénouville was living through what felt like another ordinary night of the occupation. On the canal bridge itself, 2 sentries paced back and forth across the roadway. Private Helmut Römer, 18 years old, from Berlin, walked one direction. Beside him, a 22-year-old Polish conscript, pressed into German uniform, walked the other. Their paths crossed every few minutes at the center of the bridge. They saluted. They kept walking. At midnight, the Polish sentry went off duty. He met another Polish conscript at the guard post. They were young men. They were bored. They agreed they were not sleepy. They decided to walk into the village of Bénouville, where a small brothel served cheap red wine and the company of women who did not much care which uniform the customers were wearing. By 5 minutes past midnight, both Polish sentries were sitting inside that brothel with glasses of wine in their hands. Their posts were empty. The anti-tank gun beside the bridge, a 50mm piece capable of stopping any Allied vehicle attempting to cross, sat unmanned. Inside the concrete bunker guarding the eastern approach, the men on duty were dozing at their positions. Only Helmut Römer and one other sentry were still walking the bridge itself. They had heard aircraft overhead earlier in the evening. That was normal. Allied bombers passed over Normandy every night now. Days earlier, British aircraft had bombed a cement works a few kilometers to the south, apparently for no strategic reason at all. The garrison had grown used to distant explosions in the dark. Nothing had come of any of it. Nothing ever did. This was not an accident. Allied planners had ordered those seemingly pointless bombing runs on purpose. They had spent weeks conditioning the sentries along this exact stretch of the Norman coast to ignore nighttime aircraft noise. To assume that a bomb falling in the distance meant nothing, to stop reporting what they heard. By the first minutes of June 6th, the psychological groundwork had been laid. The German sentries on Pegasus Bridge were, by then, trained to hear the beginning of the invasion and think it was nothing. At 16 minutes past midnight, Jim Walwork's glider struck the ground. The impact was violent. The nose of the hawser collapsed inward on landing. Walwork and Ainsworth were both hurled forward through the shattered cockpit and thrown clear of the aircraft. Walwork was briefly unconscious. Ainsworth was pinned beneath wreckage, one leg broken. Inside the fuselage, men were flung against each other. Equipment came loose. Wooden struts splintered. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Major John Howard opened his eyes. Through the splintered remains of the nose, dimly lit by starlight, he could make out the unmistakable structure of the canal bridge directly ahead. The wingtip of his glider had come to rest 47 meters from the bridge itself. 47 meters, half the length of a football field. Close enough that his men could reach the near sandbags at a full sprint in under a minute. Behind Howard's glider, the second hawser landed hard in the same field. The third landed nearby, all three carrying the platoons assigned to the canal bridge, all three within a few dozen meters of the target. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding the entire Allied tactical air forces, would later call it the finest feat of flying of the Second World War. But not every glider found its objective. The fourth hawser, carrying Captain Brian Priday, the company's second-in-command, along with Lieutenant Tony Hooper, had veered off course during the descent. Its tug pilots had somehow overshot the release point by several miles. The glider came down in complete darkness, its passengers convinced they were on target, and landed beside a small bridge over a river that looked, in the darkness, exactly like the objective. It was the wrong bridge, it was the wrong river, it was the River Dives, 13 kilometers to the east of Bénouville. Priday and his men, 20% of Howard's total assault force, were now completely out of position. They would fight their way back through occupied France on foot over the next several days. They would arrive at the correct bridge long after the battle was over. D Company would take Pegasus Bridge with one man short in the officer ranks and a full third fewer men than the plan had called for. They would take it anyway. There was one more casualty in those opening seconds that history rarely names properly. A young lance corporal named Fred Greenhalgh had been knocked unconscious by the impact of his glider landing. His body was thrown clear of the aircraft. He landed in a shallow pond beside the field, face down, still unconscious. He drowned there. He was the first Allied soldier killed on D-Day. He was killed by his own aircraft, not by German fire, and for that technical distinction he is remembered less than the man who died a few minutes later on the bridge itself. That man, right now, was climbing to his feet inside Walwork's glider. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge stepped through the shattered nose of the aircraft, checked his platoon behind him, and looked toward the bridge. He said only 3 words. "Come on, lads." The men of number 25 platoon began to run. They ran across 47 meters of open ground in the darkness, boots pounding the grass, weapons up, faces blackened with burnt cork. They ran past a startled sentry on the western bank, who fired a single flare into the sky, and then, in the words of another British soldier who saw it, simply turned and ran the other way. The sentry was Helmut Romer. He had heard the crash and assumed it was a shot-down bomber. He had walked toward the sound to investigate. And when he turned back toward the bridge, he saw, coming out of the darkness at a full sprint, a wall of screaming, black-faced men firing automatic weapons. He was 18 years old. He had never trained for this. Nothing in his instruction manual addressed a threat that arrived without engines, without warning, from empty air. He turned and ran, shouting one word in German as he ran. Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers. The word was wrong. They were not paratroopers. But it did not matter, because by the time anyone in the German garrison heard him shouting it, Brotheridge and his men were already crossing the bridge. Brotheridge reached the far bank at a dead run. He pulled the pin from a grenade and threw it into the concrete machine gun bunker on the eastern side. The grenade detonated inside the bunker, killing the crew. In the same instant, a German machine gunner firing from behind a wall opened up on Brotheridge from a range of perhaps 20 meters. The bullet struck him in the neck. He fell on the far side of the bridge, still holding his weapon, blood soaking into his uniform. He would live for several hours afterward. He would be carried to the small aid station that Georges and Thérèse Gondry were already setting up in the café across the road. He would die there on a stretcher without ever knowing whether the mission had succeeded. His last words on the bridge had been the platoon call sign. Come on, 25. His wife Margaret, back in England, was heavily pregnant, days away from giving birth. His daughter, whom he would never meet, would be born 4 days after the day he died. She was named Margaret after her mother. She would grow up looking at a photograph of a father she had never seen. She would visit the bridge her father had crossed decades later as an old woman herself, and she would say quietly that she was doing it not just for him. She was doing it for everybody who had never come home, but Den Brotheridge did not know any of that yet. He knew only that the bridge was taken. While Brotheridge lay dying, the fight for the eastern side of the canal bridge continued for another 8 minutes. It was fast, it was close, it was one with grenades, Sten guns, and the raw shock of men appearing where no man could possibly have come from. The demolition control point sat on the eastern bank of the canal. It had been the single most important target in Howard's briefing. The German soldier assigned to trigger the charges had been briefed for months on exactly what to do the moment enemy forces approached the bridge. When Brotheridge's platoon appeared out of the darkness, that soldier abandoned his post and ran. The connecting wires to the demolition charges were cut a few minutes later. The explosives themselves remained fully in place, fully live, still wired to their detonators, still capable of destroying the bridge if anyone had the presence of mind to reconnect a single severed wire. Nobody did. The canal bridge was secure. 470 meters to the east, the second half of Howard's force was already assaulting the Orne River Bridge. The garrison there was smaller and less alert. 3 German soldiers were overwhelmed at their posts within seconds. A 4th soldier, the man responsible for detonating that bridge's own charges, ran into the darkness without firing a shot. He was found the following morning, hiding in a drainage ditch 200 meters from his post. There is something worth sitting with about that man, uncomfortable as it may be. He was, in that single moment, the individual whose personal choice carried more direct tactical weight than any other man on the German side of Normandy that night. One flip of a switch, one train motion he had rehearsed for months, and the entire eastern flank of the D-Day invasion would have collapsed within seconds. He chose to run instead. History has largely forgotten his name. It remembers Brotheridge's in considerable detail. By 26 minutes past midnight, both bridges were fully in British hands. D Company had suffered 2 dead, Brotheridge in the café across the road and Greenhalgh in the pond behind the landing zone. Roughly 14 men had been wounded, some seriously. Given what they had just accomplished, the price was almost impossibly low. Major John Howard, standing at the eastern end of the canal bridge, his uniform torn from the glider crash, took a small handset from his radioman. He spoke 2 phrases into the transmitter, ham and jam, the code phrase for both bridges captured intact. He had chosen those words himself months earlier in England. They were the name of his favourite meal at his favourite pub. He had picked something he would never forget under pressure, something he could say through exhaustion, through blood loss, through shock. Something so ordinary that no radio operator anywhere would ever mistake its meaning. Ham and jam. The message was received at 6th Airborne Division headquarters at approximately 2 in the morning. At that same moment, roughly 400 kilometers to the east, at the Château La Roche-Guyon on the River Seine, a telephone was beginning to ring. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, was the senior officer on duty. He had received his first fragmentary report of paratroopers landing east of the Orne perhaps an hour earlier. He had assessed the report as small-scale, A diversion, most likely, a raid to draw attention away from the real invasion further north at the Pas-de-Calais. He had not yet called Rommel in Germany, he had not yet called Hitler. At his mountain retreat in Bavaria, Adolf Hitler was asleep. His staff had strict standing orders that under no circumstances was the Führer to be woken except by his personal chief of operations. That chief of operations, General Alfred Jodl, would not authorize the wake-up call for many more hours yet. Around 4 in the morning, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the west, would formally request the release of the panzer reserves. Jodl would refuse the request. The Führer, he would say, is not to be disturbed. By dawn, the eastern flank of the German defensive position in Normandy would still be officially secure, according to every map at every headquarters from Paris to Berchtesgaden. By dawn, the eastern flank would in fact already be lost. Because on the canal bridge at Bénouville, John Howard and 180 of his surviving men were digging in. They had 6 P-80 anti-tank launchers of limited reliability. They had Bren guns, they had rifles and grenades, and the wreckage of 3 gliders scattered in the field behind them. They had a bridge wired with live explosives that nobody had yet dared to remove. They had a lieutenant dying quietly in the cafe across the road. And they had a promise, made by another officer named Brigadier Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, commanding the 1st Special Service Brigade, that reinforcements would reach them from the coast by midday. Midday was still 9 hours away. The Germans would come long before then. The first German counterattack arrived at the canal bridge before 1 o'clock in the morning. It came from the south, up the road from Bénouville, in a column of ordinary trucks, with their headlights still burning. The men inside were infantry from the 736th Regiment. They had been alerted by fragmentary reports of unknown activity near the crossings. They did not know the bridge had fallen. They did not know a British Bren gun was already dug in at the western approach, sighted directly down the road they were driving. The lead truck rounded the final bend. The British Bren gun opened fire at close range. The truck came apart in a spray of glass and metal. The driver was killed at the wheel. Men in the back of the truck spilled out onto the road, some already wounded, some crawling for cover in the ditches. The German column stopped where it stood. The infantry dismounted and tried to attack across open ground on foot. They were driven back. They regrouped. They tried again from a slightly different angle. They were driven back a second time. By the time a third probe came from the direction of Ranville, British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division were already dropping in strength across the fields east of the river. That third German attack collapsed almost immediately, caught in a crossfire between Howard's men and the paratroopers converging on the same ground from the opposite direction. At the chateau at La Roche-Guyon, General Hans Speidel was still trying to assemble a coherent picture from telephone reports that contradicted each other every 15 minutes. At Berchtesgaden, in the mountains of Bavaria, Adolf Hitler was still asleep. At Herlingen, in a small villa near Ulm, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was preparing to eat breakfast with his wife on the morning of her 50th birthday. None of them yet understood that the war in the west had already turned. At dawn, a second German force arrived at the bridge. This one was larger. This one had armor, 2 half-tracks, and what appeared, in the early morning light, to be either a light tank or an armored car came up the road toward the canal crossing. Behind them, German infantry advanced in staggered lines. The lead vehicle's commander could see the bridge in the distance now, could see British soldiers moving in the shadows of the girders. He had orders to retake the crossing at any cost. In a shallow ditch beside the road, a young British corporal named Bill Gray lay flat on his stomach with a P anti-tank launcher against his shoulder. He had never fired the weapon in actual combat before. He had trained with it, he had studied it, he knew in theory how it worked. He also knew that the Piat was notoriously unreliable at anything but close range, that it kicked violently, that it sometimes failed to launch its projectile at all. He waited. He waited until the lead vehicle was close enough that a clean miss would be almost impossible. Then he squeezed the trigger. The projectile hit the vehicle directly. It began to burn. Ammunition inside the vehicle began to cook off in the growing flames, small explosions sending tracer fire in every direction along the road. The German infantry advancing behind it stopped in the road, watching their armor die in front of them, and after several seconds they began to fall back in some disorder. Post-war analysis would eventually identify the destroyed vehicle as a reconnaissance element rather than a serious armored spearhead. It did not matter. The tactical effect was the same. Word spread quickly through the German ranks that the bridge was defended by something with real anti-tank capability, something considerably more dangerous than the disorganized handful of survivors German intelligence had initially assumed. A German battalion commander filed a report later that morning describing the situation at Bénouville in terms that read now with an almost unmistakable note of confusion. The position, he wrote, was held by a force of unknown but apparently substantial size, equipped with real anti-tank capability. German infantry could not advance further without armored support that could not in turn reach the beaches without crossing bridges that infantry could not retake. The circle had closed. While Howard's men were holding their ground through the morning, the larger German armored response was unraveling across the entire Normandy theatre in parallel. The 21st Panzer Division, the only major armoured formation immediately available near Caen, spent the critical hours of that morning waiting for orders that arrived late and then arrived contradicting themselves. Its commander, General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, could not be located when the first reports came in. He was in Paris. His division stood beside its warmed-up tanks and waited. When Feuchtinger was finally found and returned to his headquarters, he received one set of orders directing him to strike the British paratroopers east of the Orne, then a second set redirecting him toward the beaches themselves. The redirection cost his division 3.5 hours of movement time. 3.5 hours. The British 3rd Infantry Division, coming ashore at Sword Beach, used those 3.5 hours to establish prepared anti-tank defences along the very axis of attack the panzers were now ordered to take. 6-pounder guns dug in behind hedgerows, anti-tank riflemen positioned along stone walls. The exact ground the panzers were about to drive into had been prepared, in careful detail, to receive them. When Feuchtinger's tanks finally began their run for the coast that afternoon, they ran directly into a fresh wave of Allied airborne troops parachuting and gliding into position squarely in their path. Feuchtinger watched from a forward command post as what appeared to be an entire additional airborne division landed directly in front of his advance. He was watching, in fact, the second major lift of the British 6th Airborne, landing precisely where Allied planners had specifically intended to block German armour from ever reaching the beaches. This was not luck. Allied planners had timed that second lift specifically to reinforce the eastern flank at the exact hour German armour was most likely to finally begin moving. A calculated bet on German response time. The bet landed almost precisely on target. A small handful of Feuchtinger's tanks did briefly reach the coast that afternoon, breaking through the gap between the British landings at Sword and the Canadian landings at Juno. They arrived to find open beach, no organised enemy line, and the ships of the invasion fleet stretch out toward the horizon. They also arrived to find themselves alone. The moment the German tank crews realized they were exposed without infantry support, in direct view of a naval fleet whose 15-inch guns could reach them from more than 15 miles out, they turned around and retreated. The one panzer thrust that actually reached the sea on D-Day, in the end, retreated on its own before a single naval shell was fired. By late morning, Adolf Hitler was awake at Berchtesgaden. By early afternoon, he had finally authorized the release of the strategic panzer reserves. By the time those reserves began to move, Allied fighter bombers were already hunting German columns along every major road in Normandy. The armoured counterattack that could have decided the invasion never happened. It never happened because the specific road the panzers needed had already been closed. It had been closed since 5 minutes past midnight by 180 men who had arrived without engines, in complete silence in the darkness. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, John Howard heard something coming up the road from the direction of the coast. It was not artillery, it was not gunfire, it was the sound of Scottish bagpipes. Lord Lovat was walking at the head of a column of British commandos who had come ashore at Sword Beach at 8 that morning and fought their way inland ever since. At the head of the column, playing the bagpipes as ordered, was Lovat's personal piper, a 21-year-old Scot named Bill Millin. Bagpipes had been banned as a battlefield instrument by the British War Office years earlier. Too many pipers had been killed in the First World War standing exposed on open ground. Bill Millin knew this. Lord Lovat knew it too. Lovat had told him in a quiet aside back in England that the War Office order was English. He was Scottish, and Millin was Scottish, and the order did not apply to them. The German artillery was still falling intermittently around the bridge. Bill Millin kept playing. Lovat had promised Howard months earlier in England that his commandos would reach the bridge by midday. By the account Lovat himself repeated for the rest of his life, he arrived 2 minutes and 30 seconds late. He walked across the canal bridge, past the smoking wreckage of the German armoured vehicle Bill Grey had killed at dawn, past the small cafe where Den Brotheridge had died a few hours earlier, and he shook Major John Howard's hand. The link-up was complete. The eastern flank had held. A German intelligence officer, observing the scene from a distance beyond the British perimeter, filed a report later that afternoon estimating the size of the British force holding the bridges at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men, supported by armour. The actual number was 181. There was no armour of any kind. There were 6 P-8 launchers of limited reliability and a pile of dead German infantry along the approach road. The German officer was not incompetent. He was looking directly at a position that had held for more than 10 straight hours against every serious attempt to dislodge it. He was drawing the only reasonable conclusion available to a professional soldier looking at what he was actually seeing. A position holding that firmly for that long had to be larger than the eye could see. In its own quiet way, that mistaken estimate was a genuine tribute to what D Company had accomplished. It was also, in a very real sense, the moment a German staff officer first committed to paper something several of his colleagues had already been privately concluding since 1 in the morning. Something had gone profoundly, structurally wrong along the entire eastern flank, and it could not now be meaningfully fixed. After the war, when German staff officers sat down to reconstruct exactly what had happened on the morning of June 6th, they searched, as professional soldiers do, for the single decisive moment. The one specific error that had unlocked everything else. They found a genuine list of larger institutional failures, the weather report they had trusted. The commanders who had been absent, the panzer reserves held too far back, the Führer who had slept until 10 in the morning. But beneath all of those larger failures, they identified one narrower catastrophe that had preceded and enabled all the others. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's own chief of staff, wrote it plainly in his own post-war memoir. The loss of the Orne crossings before H. Hour, he wrote, had removed every realistic option for an early armoured counterattack against the eastern beach sector. German forces could not cross, they could not seal the perimeter in time, and everything that followed across the remainder of that day was, in the most direct sense, the accumulated consequence of that single fact. Everything that followed. Speidel wrote something else too, something that has stayed with military historians ever since. He wrote that the eastern flank had remained genuinely open to German forces right up until the precise moment it was not, and that by the time it closed, it had already closed before German command fully understood it required defending at all. Before we knew it needed to be defended. That specific phrase deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the part of this account that most tends to be buried in footnotes. German planners had prepared for the invasion for months in genuine methodical depth. They had built the Atlantic Wall, they had wired the bridges for demolition. They had developed considered responses to almost every contingency their own planning process could imagine. They had simply never imagined this specific one. They had never imagined that soldiers could be flown in complete silence, in total darkness, to a target they had trained against for 18 months. That those soldiers could land within 47 meters of a defended bridge. That they could cross that bridge before a single sentry finished deciding whether the moment genuinely called for raising an alarm. Nothing quite like it had ever been attempted before. D Company suffered real casualties in the hours immediately following its initial success. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge died in the small cafe across the road. tended to at the end by Georges and Thérèse Gondry on the same wooden floor where Thérèse had once served drinks to the German soldiers whose garrison she had helped to destroy. He was buried in the churchyard at Ranville, a short walk from the bridge he had crossed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, on June 16th, would sign the paperwork granting Brotheridge an immediate military cross. But regulations at the time prevented the military cross from being awarded posthumously, and Brotheridge was already dead. The medal was quietly downgraded to a mention in dispatches. His widow Margaret gave birth 4 days after his death. His daughter would eventually stand on that bridge 60 years after her father had crossed it and speak to the men who had crossed it beside him. The Gondry Café became the first house in occupied France to be liberated by Allied forces on D-Day. Their daughter Arlette, 4 years old that summer, would grow up in that same café. She would eventually inherit it. She would run it for the rest of her life, serving coffee to British veterans and their families every June, and she would still be running it as an old woman well into the 21st century. The canal bridge itself was formally renamed Pegasus Bridge later that summer, in honor of the winged horse of Greek mythology that adorned the shoulder patch of the 6th Airborne Division. Major John Howard was wounded in a road accident in Great Britain in November of 1944 and forced to leave the army in 1946. He returned to civilian life, worked as a civil servant for the next 28 years, and retired quietly in 1974. He died in 1999 at the age of 86 after decades of returning to the bridge every June to walk it again with the survivors of D Company. Fewer of them came each year. Eventually, only Howard came. Then, one year, he did not come either. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, who had piloted the lead glider with a broken wrist and a concussion, recovered fully from his injuries. He lived until to 2013, one of the last surviving glider pilots of the entire war. Corporal Bill Gray, who had destroyed a German armoured vehicle with a weapon he had never fired in actual combat, survived the war entirely. Private Helmut Römer, the 18-year-old Berliner who had first heard the impossible sound in the darkness and had turned and run instead of raising the alarm, was captured within minutes of the assault. He spent the rest of the war as a British prisoner. He returned to Germany afterward. He lived a quiet civilian life. Decades later, as an old man, he began to visit the bridge again on the anniversaries of the battle. He met the British veterans he had once fled from in the dark. He shook their hands. He drank with them at the Café Gondry. He formed real friendships with several of them that lasted the rest of his life. There is a particular kind of grace in that. A young man on the wrong end of history, given 6 more decades of life he might reasonably have expected to lose in the first 10 minutes of D-Day, choosing to spend part of that life returning to the exact spot where the world nearly ended for him and drinking coffee with the men who had let him live. He said, in interviews later, that he had been a boy, that he had not understood what he was standing on. That he was grateful, in the specific way old men are grateful for time they did not earn, that he had lived to see what came after. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man who had named the coming battle the longest day and then chosen to spend that longest day at home with his wife, was called at Herlingen at 10:15 that morning. He climbed into his Horch staff car within the hour. He drove west through the length of that day, listening to fragmentary radio reports, understanding by degrees that the war he had been preparing for had already been decided in his absence. He reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon that same evening, roughly 22 hours after Howard's gliders had touched down. He fought the losing campaign of his career through June and July of 1944. On July 17th, his staff car was strafed by Allied fighter bombers on a road near Vimoutiers. He survived the attack, but was seriously wounded. His driver was killed at the wheel. 3 months later, on October 14, 1944, having been implicated in the July plot against Hitler Life, Rommel was offered a choice at his home in Herlingen. Trial and disgrace, or suicide with full military honours and the safety of his family guaranteed. He chose the cyanide. He said goodbye to his son Manfred. He put on his overcoat. He climbed into a staff car with 2 Wehrmacht officers. He was driven a short distance from his own front door. He was dead within 15 minutes. His wife Lucy survived him by 27 years. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers would die on the beaches and in the fields of Normandy on that single day. Tens of thousands more would die in the campaign that followed through the summer. The war in Europe would continue for another 11 months. It would end in the ruins of Berlin in May of 1945. But here is the specific detail that popular D-Day mythology tends to quietly obscure, buried as it usually is beneath the larger, more visually dramatic story of Omaha Beach and Pointe du Hoc. The German army never reached the D-Day beaches in serious armored force that day, not because of the firepower waiting on the beaches themselves, though that firepower was entirely real. Not simply because of Allied air superiority, though the fighter bombers hunting German columns along the roads of Normandy that day were a constant and well-founded terror to every driver on those roads. The German army never reached the beaches in force because the specific road it needed had already been closed. It had been closed since 5 minutes past midnight, technically before the invasion had even formally begun, by men who had arrived without engines, landing silently in a dark field beside a canal. Germany did not lose D-Day on the beaches. They lost it in a bedroom at the Berghof, where a dictator slept through the opening hours of his own destruction. They lost it in a war game at Rennes, where the men who should have been at their posts were rehearsing a scenario that was already unfolding without them. They lost it in a Paris apartment, where the commander of the only panzer division within striking distance of the beaches could not be reached by his own staff. They lost it in a small villa at Herlingen, where a field marshal drank coffee with his wife on the morning of her 50th birthday and did not yet know that the war he had spent 3 years fighting had already been decided without him. They lost it in the first 10 minutes, before any beach was stormed, before the first American soldier waded through the surf at Omaha, before the first British landing craft lowered its ramp at Sword, before the first ranger climbed the cliff at Pointe du Hoc. Before any of the images that would define D-Day in the American imagination were even possible, 6 gliders landed silently in a dark field beside a French canal. 181 men ran flat out toward 2 small bridges. They were across and fighting before the German sentries pacing those bridges had even fully processed that the sound they had just heard was not, in fact, the wind. Was not in fact a shot-down bomber, was in fact the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. They did not know it yet. Neither did anyone else. But by 26 minutes past midnight on the 6th of June 1944, the longest day was already over. Germany had already lost, and in a small café on the western bank of the Caen Canal, as the evening of that longest day finally settled over Normandy, Georges Gondry walked out into his garden with a lantern in his hand. He knelt in the dirt near the back wall, where 4 years earlier, on the day the Germans had first walked into his village, he had buried 99 bottles of champagne beneath the soil. He dug them up, one by one. He carried them into the café where his wife Thérèse was tending the wounded on the wooden floor. Their daughter Arlette, 4 years old, watched from the doorway. Georges walked back out to the bridge with the first bottle in his hand. He walked past the body of Den Brotheridge, laid gently against the wall of his own café. He walked toward the exhausted British soldiers still holding the bridge in the fading light. He offered them the champagne he had been saving for 4 years. He had been waiting a long time. They had all been waiting a long time. And the war, though nobody outside that small circle of exhausted men yet understood it, had already begun to end.